The night was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that carries weight, the kind that makes you feel like the earth is holding its breath. Jacob stood alone by the banks of the Jabbok River, heart pounding with the weight of an unresolved past and the uncertainty of the morning to come. He had sent everyone ahead, his wives, his children, his servants, his livestock, everything he had acquired over the years. Across the river, his family prepared to meet Esau, the brother he had wronged so many years before. Jacob stayed behind, not because he was afraid to face Esau, but because something deeper needed to be faced first. This was not just a night of solitude, it would become a night of struggle, a night that would change everything. Jacob had lived much of his life on the run. From the moment he grasped Esau's heel at birth, he was striving, scheming, surviving. He tricked his brother out of his birthright, deceived his father, fled from home, then worked years for his uncle Laban, only to be deceived himself. Now, years later, with a household of blessings and a name that carried weight, he was still haunted by the shadows of who he had been, and on this night, those shadows took form. Out of the dark, a man appeared. No words, no warning, just sudden, fierce contact. Jacob didn't know who he was wrestling. It could have been Esau, a stranger, an angel, or a dream, but it was real. The kind of real that leaves you gasping for breath and scraping the ground for leverage. They wrestled through the night. No sleep, no surrender, no clear explanation, only the sound of grunting, struggle, and the river nearby, echoing every groan and movement. What was this? Why was God meeting Jacob in the form of a fight? Because sometimes that's what transformation looks like. Not peaceful prayer, not whispered revelation, but a raw, exhausting, soul-wrenching struggle. Jacob wasn't just fighting a man, he was wrestling with his identity, with guilt, with fear, with everything he had buried beneath his cleverness and ambition. This was not a battle of fists, it was a battle for the soul. And just as dawn was breaking, the man touched Jacob's hip and instantly dislocated it. The fight shifted, pain surged. Jacob could no longer overpower or outmaneuver. All he could do now was cling, and cling he did. He held on through the pain, through the confusion, through the limp and the sweat and the tears. "I will not let you go unless you bless me," he said. Those words weren't a demand, they were a confession. Jacob was no longer trying to win. He was begging for something deeper, a name, a purpose, a new beginning. And then came the question, what is your name? Not because God didn't know, but because Jacob needed to speak it. Jacob, the deceiver, the supplanter, the man who had manipulated his way through life. But that night, after speaking the truth of who he had been, he received a new name, Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. That name wasn't about victory in the traditional sense. It was about endurance, persistence, the courage to wrestle with God and not walk away. Before we go further, I want to take a moment and thank you for listening. If this message is speaking to you, if you've ever found yourself wrestling through the night with questions, identity, or God himself, then I invite you to like this podcast, leave a comment about what this story means to you, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe for more episodes like this. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content that reaches others on their journey of faith. Let's return to Jacob. When the sun rose over the horizon, Jacob was limping. The fight had left its mark. He would never walk the same again. But that limp wasn't a weakness, it was a testimony, a reminder that he had met God in the dark and survived. Painful encounters with God often leave a mark, not to shame us, but to remind us of the encounter, to anchor our identity in something deeper than comfort. Jacob met Esau later that day. But the man who approached his brother was not the same man who had crossed the Jabbok the night before. He had a new name, a limp, and a different spirit. Because when you wrestle with God, you don't leave unchanged. This story isn't just about Jacob, it's about all of us who've wrestled in the night, all of us who've come to the end of our strength, who've faced the consequences of our past, who've felt like we needed to fight through the darkness to find clarity, healing, and truth. Maybe your wrestling doesn't look like Jacob's. Maybe it's anxiety that keeps you up. Maybe it's guilt from choices made long ago. Maybe it's the fear of the future or the weight of responsibility that feels too heavy to carry. Whatever your struggle, the message of that night is clear. God is not afraid of your wrestle. He doesn't walk away from your questions. He meets you in them. We often think faith means having everything figured out, but sometimes faith looks like not letting go, like holding on through the confusion, like clinging when everything in you wants to collapse. Jacob's blessing didn't come through avoidance. It came through confrontation, through facing his fears, through staying in the fight. There's something sacred about a faith that limps, a faith that walks slower but deeper, a faith that's been refined in the fire of the night, that's not built on perfect performance but on persistent pursuit. God could have spoken to Jacob in a dream. He had done it before, but this time Jacob needed to wrestle. He needed to engage physically, emotionally, spiritually. Sometimes the breakthrough doesn't come until we're willing to struggle honestly before God. And what about that name, Israel? It would go on to define an entire nation, a people marked not by perfection, but by perseverance, not by endless victory, but by relentless trust. God chose to build a covenant on someone who had struggled with him and survived. That's the kind of faith God honors. Not sanitized, not polished, but raw, honest, real. Maybe you're in a season right now where it feels like God is wrestling you more than blessing you. Maybe the prayers feel unanswered, the nights feel long, and your soul is tired from holding on. Don't let go, not because you're strong, but because He is faithful. Sometimes the struggle is the blessing, because it brings you face to face with the God who sees you, the God who names you, the God who changes your story. When Jacob limped away from that river, he had no guarantees about how Esau would respond, but he had something better. He had encountered God, and that encounter gave him the strength to face whatever came next. You may still face Esau in the morning. You may still carry the consequences of your past, but after wrestling with God, you don't carry them the same way. You walk differently, you see differently, you live differently, and every step, though limping, is filled with purpose. Because God met you in the dark, and you came out with a name that heaven knows. So keep holding on. Morning is coming, and with it the light that reveals who you've truly become. This is the story of the night Jacob wrestled God and found not defeat, but a new identity. And maybe, just maybe, it's your story too. So many of us crave clarity, yet God offers us encounter. We ask for direction, and He offers transformation. We want the path made easy, but He invites us to wrestle, because in the wrestling, He reshapes us. When Jacob entered that night, he thought he was alone. He was surrounded by uncertainty, haunted by a past he could no longer escape, and afraid of what waited at sunrise. But it was in that isolation that he discovered intimacy. Sometimes God removes the distractions, separates us from the crowd, and allows us to wrestle so that we come out different than we went in. He knows that true change doesn't happen at a distance. It happens face to face. Jacob had always used his mind, his strategy, his manipulation to move forward in life. But this time, none of that would help him. This was a battle he couldn't think his way out of. He had to feel it. He had to fight it. He had to endure it. And in the end, it wasn't about winning. It was about holding on, about staying engaged, about refusing to walk away without a touch from God. Your limp doesn't disqualify you. It marks you. Your midnight wrestle is not a sign of weak faith. It's the evidence of real faith, because only those who believe God is there keep holding on through the night. When you wrestle with God, it may hurt, it may cost you your comfort, it may leave you walking differently, but it will also leave you knowing who you are, and more importantly, who He is. So take courage, stay in the wrestle, because the blessing is not always in the answer, it's in the encounter. And the name He gives you on the other side will carry more power than anything you've ever built on your own. This is the legacy of Jacob. This is the invitation for you to meet God in the night and never walk the same again.